The first sign was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of a Norwegian autumn evening, the kind that settles over the Hardanger Plateau like a wool blanket, full of wind and crow and the distant knock of a woodpecker working a birch. This was a different silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums, the kind that makes the hairs on your forearms stand up before your brain has finished processing why. Bastian noticed it at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, which was not a dramatic hour for first contact. He was sitting in the kitchen of the house he shared with his brother Urban, eating cold lefse and reading a 3-week-old sports magazine because the Wi-Fi was down again. He noticed the silence the way you notice a smell, slowly then all at once. The refrigerator had stopped humming. The clock on the wall had stopped ticking. Even the wind outside, which had been worrying the spruce trees all evening, had gone still. He looked up. Through the window over the sink, the sky had turned a pale, arterial red. Bastian was 26 years old. He was not brave in any way he could have articulated before that night. He was good at trivia, mediocre at football, excellent at remembering everyone's coffee order, and he had once talked a very confused reindeer out of the middle of the E-134 by playing a Ylvis song on his phone. These were not the qualities that feature prominently in stories about humanity's finest hour. But they were the qualities he had, and as it turned out, they were exactly what the situation required. He put down the lefse. He went to the window. He looked up at the red sky. Urban, he called. His brother appeared in the doorway wearing a headlamp and holding a socket wrench, because Urban was always in the middle of fixing something. What? Come look at this. Urban came and looked. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Urban said very quietly, "Is that a ship?" It was a ship. Several ships, in fact. Great dark oblongs hanging in the sky above the valley, like storm clouds that had grown confident, arranged in a formation that suggested either military precision or a very large parking lot. They were enormous. The smallest of them was larger than the town center. The largest of them was, Bastian would later estimate, roughly the size of Hardanger itself, though he acknowledged that his sense of scale was not calibrated for objects in the upper atmosphere. The red light was coming from underneath them. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like something breathing. "Should we call someone?" Urban asked. "Who do you call for this?" A reasonable question. They stood at the window for another 40 seconds. Then the broadcast started. It came from everywhere simultaneously. From the television they hadn't turned on, from their phones, from the kitchen radio that ran on batteries. A low, resonant sound that was not quite language and then suddenly was. A voice that had clearly been processed through some kind of translation architecture. Slightly too precise, slightly too even, like a news anchor from a country that does not allow imprecision. "Attention, humans of the region. The penis hegemony extends greetings and preliminary notification of administrative transition. Your species has been categorized under Directive Sigma 7 as a Class 3 biologically persistent population requiring resource allocation restructuring. Compliance is expected. Non-compliance will be managed. Thank you." A pause. Then identically the message repeated in what sounded like German, then what might have been Sami, then English. Bastian looked at Urban. Urban looked at Bastian. "Administrative transition," Urban said. "Yeah, that's the worst thing I've ever heard." Agreed. They did not panic. This was not because they were unusually calm people. Urban once hyperventilated at a particularly aggressive goose. But because panic requires a clear understanding of what you are panicking about, and they did not yet have that. What they had was the old instinct. When the situation's outstrips the available emotional vocabulary, you make coffee, you make a plan, and you start walking toward the problem rather than away from it. They made coffee. By the time the coffee was ready, Eric had arrived. Eric Uren came in through the back door the way he always did, without knocking, wearing his long coat with all the pockets and carrying the portable radio scanner he'd had since he was 14. He was Bastian and Urban's oldest friend, and their most frequent source of both excellent ideas and serious trouble, and he had the kind of face that inspired trust in strangers and mild alarm in anyone who actually knew him well. He set the scanner on the kitchen table, accepted a coffee without asking for one, and said, "I've been monitoring their transmissions for the last 20 minutes. "What are they saying?" Bastian asked. "A lot of bureaucratic language I don't fully understand. Something about resource yield projections and population management timelines. They talk about us the way a logistics company talks about pallets." He turned the scanner's dial. A burst of alien sound filled the kitchen, rapid and clicking, and then resolving through whatever translation process was running into fragments. Sector 7, Compliance Assessment in Progress. Human biological yield within projected parameters. Lord Zex has confirmed primary extraction coordinates. Lord Zex, Urban said. That's the one in charge. I've heard the name 4 times now. Always said with a certain weight. Like a threat, like a title. But also, yes, like a threat. Bastian had his phone out, trying to reach someone in Oslo. The line connected briefly, and he got 30 seconds of a panicked civil defense recording before the signal dropped. He tried again. Nothing. He looked out the window. The red light was intensifying. "They're coming down," Urban said. He was right. One of the smaller ships, still the size of a large shopping center, was descending toward the valley floor. Slowly. The deliberateness of it was its own kind of terror. This was not an ambush. This was a checkout procedure. They were not landing because they were in a hurry. They were landing because there was nothing, in their estimation, that could stop them. That estimation was about to have a very Norwegian evening. The penis soldiers came down first in what appeared to be some kind of drop pod sequence. Each pod a dull copper color, trailing heated air, hitting the field behind the Hullesley house with a series of impacts that shook the windows. The soldiers that emerged were roughly humanoid in shape. 2 legs, 2 arms, bilateral symmetry, but the resemblance ended there. They were tall. Their skin, if it was skin, was the color of old pewter and moved slightly, the way oil moves on water, iridescent and unsettling. Their heads were elongated, their eyes set wide, pale and luminescent, and they communicated with each other in rapid overlapping clicks and low tonal pulses that the translation device, which they carried on a unit attached to the foremost soldier's chest, rendered in that same too smooth voice. Sector complete. Population present. Initiating compliance protocol. There were 12 of them visible from the kitchen window. Bastian counted automatically the way he always counted things. Steps to the door, seats in a room, soldiers in a field. 12, he said. I see them, Urban said. They're going for the house. I know. Eirik had already moved to the back door. There's a storm drain, he said, not quite asking. Behind the woodshed, Bastian said. Right. Kitchen, woodshed, drain, and then we come up in the Hansen field. I know a way from there to the old NATO relay station up on the ridge. Why the relay station? Eirik looked at him. Because if they're jamming our signals, the relay station's hardware is old enough that it runs on a different band. If anything's still broadcasting, it'll be coming from there. He paused. Also, I left a bag of equipment there 3 months ago, and I'd like to collect it. You had a bag of equipment at a decommissioned military relay station, Urban said. I have bags of equipment in a lot of places. This seemed like a relevant time to mention it. They went, out the back door, across the yard, the cold night air hitting them like a hand. Behind them, the lead penis soldier was speaking its compliance protocol to the front door of an empty house. They could hear it. The voice carrying oddly through the darkness, very certain, very official, addressing a door. Bastian almost felt bad for it. Almost. The woodshed was 30 meters. The storm drain was another 15. Urban went first, because Urban had the headlamp, and Bastian went last, because he always did. As he dropped into the drain, he heard the sound of the penis soldiers entering the house. Very methodical, very organized. He pulled the grate shut above him and moved. The drain came up in the Hansen field as promised. They emerged into long grass and cold fog, the alien ships hanging above them painting everything red. The valley had changed already in the hour since first contact. There were lights moving in the direction of town, the kind of organized movement that suggested the penis were not limiting themselves to the Hullesley property. Somewhere to the south something was burning. We need to move fast, Eirik said. He was already reading his scanner, walking without looking at his feet the way he always did, trusting his body to handle the terrain while his mind handled the information. I'm picking up signals from other human groups. At least 4 separate clusters moving toward high ground. People are figuring it out. Figuring what out? Bastian asked. That the towns are being swept, systematically, but they're sweeping from the roads. The old paths, the ridgelines, the unmarked ways, they don't have those in their maps. How do you know they don't have those in their maps? Eirik glanced at him. Because they're penis soldiers, and these are our mountains. He said it the way a person states a physical fact, the way you'd say water is wet or the sun rises east. These are our mountains. There was no pride in it, no drama. Just the flat certainty of someone who had walked those ridges since he was 8 years old, who knew which boulders were good to shelter behind, and which slopes went treacherous when wet, and where the old summer pasture trails went when the roads didn't, which was almost everywhere. That knowledge was about to matter more than any technology either side possessed. The relay station was 40 minutes of hard, walking up a slope that the penis soldiers with their longer legs and their pods and their obvious preference for organized terrain would find deeply inconvenient. Eirik led them at a pace that hurt. Urban, who was larger and stronger but less accustomed to moving quietly, kept up without complaint. Bastian brought up the rear and thought. He was good at thinking while moving. He thought about the broadcast. He thought about the translation architecture, the slight delay, the over-precision of the rendered speech, the way it consistently struggled with idiom. He thought about Lord Zex. He thought about the phrase compliance assessment. He thought about the fact that the soldiers had announced themselves, instead of simply acting, which suggested that they expected compliance to happen, which meant they had experience with populations that complied. He thought about what populations that do not comply look like to an entity that expects compliance. He thought, maybe the most important thing we have right now is that they don't know what we're like yet. The relay station was a prefabricated concrete building the size of a large garage, half buried into the ridge, its antenna array pointing at a sky that was now full of alien warships. The door was padlocked. Eirik produced a key. Bastian did not ask. Inside, the smell of cold concrete and old electronics, a row of equipment racks, an ancient HF radio transceiver the Norwegian military had forgotten to decommission when they updated the system in 2009, and Eirik's bag, which turned out to contain a laptop, several power banks, a handheld spectrum analyzer, and a very good thermos of what was still, against all reasonable expectation, warm coffee. You had coffee in your emergency bag, Urban said. I have priorities, Eirik said. He had the radio on in 4 minutes. The HF bands were chaos, bursts of alien signal on the high frequencies, then, lower down, the sound of human voices, scattered, confused, frightened, but there. People on shortwave, people with the same idea. People all over the country, talking to each other in the frequencies the penis hadn't thought to sweep yet. Because why would an interstellar hegemony expect to encounter meaningful resistance on 7 megahertz? Bastian pulled the microphone toward him. Urban put a hand on his arm. What are you going to say? A fair question. He held the mic for a moment and thought about the voices he'd heard on the way up. The scattered, frightened fragments of people, trying to make sense of something that didn't fit in any existing category. He thought about what they needed. Not information exactly. They had information. They could all see the ships. What they needed was a frame. A way to organize what they were seeing into something that had a shape. Something that suggested that the shape could be dealt with. He keyed the mic. This is a station on the Hardanger Ridge. I don't know who's listening. If you are, the ships are real, the soldiers are real, and they are not unbeatable. I've seen how they move. They move like something that's never been told no. That's useful information. They're sweeping the roads and the towns, because that's where populations go in the maps they brought with them. The maps they brought with them are wrong. Get off the roads, get onto the old paths, get to high ground. They're very organized and very certain, and I think those are the same thing, and I think that's a weakness. Stay on this frequency. We'll coordinate from here. He let go of the mic. Silence then. From the speaker a voice. Copy that, Hardanger Ridge. This is Voss, we hear you. Then, another, Christiansen. Listening. Then 3 more overlapping. Urban let out a long breath. Eirik was already at the spectrum analyzer, beginning to map the alien signal patterns. His kafuckle going cold beside him, because when Eirik was working, he forgot about everything else, which was one of his best and most exhausting qualities. Bastian looked at his brother. Urban looked back. Between them passed something that did not require words, the acknowledgement of the size of what was happening, and the equally wordless decision that the size of it was not going to be the determining factor. Right, Urban said. What do we actually know about these Penis soldiers? They spent the next 2 hours building a picture. Eirik mapped their signal frequencies and identified that the translation hardware operated on a distinct band, which meant it could be overloaded with interference. Urban, who had spent 15 years repairing engines and heavy machinery, looked at the footage they'd captured on their phones before the cellular network went down and identified something interesting about the soldiers' gait. The armor, if it was armor, covered them from neck to ankle, but the joints were mechanical. Servos, possibly, or something analogous to servos. The way they moved, there was a slight lag in the knee joint, a compensation pattern, as if the exosuit was adjusting for gravity slightly heavier than the local conditions. They're used to heavier gravity, Urban said. He used a paper napkin to sketch what he was seeing, the way he always sketched things he was working out, in quick functional lines. Their suits are compensating. They're actually lighter than us, under the armor. They're strong, but they're not naturally strong here. They're overextended, Bastian said. Not physically, I mean situationally. They came in assuming a compliance operation, not a resistance operation. Their supply chain is organized for processing, not for fighting. How do you know that? Because when you're organizing a fight, you don't announce yourself first. You announce yourself first when the announcement is the action. The announcement is supposed to make the population stop moving, so you can process them. We're still moving. So what do we do with that? Bastian looked at the radio. We keep moving, and we make it cost them more to process us than we're worth. He said it simply, the way you state an engineering problem, which was essentially what it was. The penis hegemony had a resource yield calculation somewhere in their administrative systems. A number that said whether a given population was worth the effort of full compliance enforcement versus some more convenient arrangement. Every human that kept moving, kept coordinating, kept making the compliance operation more expensive, was pushing that number in one direction. The trick was to push hard enough. Over the following 48 hours, things happened very fast and then very slow and then fast again, which is the rhythm of all crises and which no one ever quite gets used to. The Penis completed their sweep of the main valley towns and began processing the populations they'd gathered in holding structures, large temporary buildings that went up with alarming speed, clearly prefabricated, clearly part of a standard deployment kit. The processing appeared to be bureaucratic rather than violent, which was in some ways more disturbing. The aliens moved through the holding areas with scanning equipment and clipboards, or the alien equivalent of clipboards, which were flat panels that emitted a faint blue light, cataloging people with the focused efficiency of a census operation. This was apparently what administrative transition looked like. The people on the ridges and the old paths were a different problem. The network that had started on 7 MHz expanded, organized, found its shape. Groups that had thought they were alone discovered they were part of something larger. The old knowledge started flowing. Who knew which routes, which valleys were accessible from the east but not the west? Which farms had root cellars, which cabins had wood stoves? Where to find water in the high country when the weather turned? Eric coordinated from the relay station with the focus of a man who had been waiting his whole life to do exactly this, though he would have strongly denied this characterization if asked. Lord Zex made his first direct appearance on the third day. Bastian heard the announcement on the radio before he saw anything, that too smooth translated voice, but louder now, wider broadcast, carrying across the whole network. Attention non-compliant human population elements. Lord Zex, operational commander of the Penis 4th Hegemonic Expeditionary Force, extends a final notification. Administrative processing is complete for compliant population sectors. Non-compliant elements represent a statistical anomaly that will be resolved within the standard operational timeline. Lord Zex notes that continued non-compliance is inefficient for all parties and requests direct communication from any designated representatives. He wants to negotiate, Urban said. He wants us to stop, Bastian said. He's framing it as a negotiation so we don't feel like we're surrendering. But he's asking us to stop. Why would he ask if he could just make us stop? Because he can't make us stop. Not yet. Not without it costing more than his yield projections allow. He looked at the radio for a long moment. He thought about the announcement. He thought about the specific phrasing. Statistical anomaly that will be resolved. The certainty of it. The administrative calm of it. He thought about what it must look like, from up there in the large ships, to encounter a species that just kept going, kept finding ways, kept talking to each other on frequencies you hadn't thought to jam, because why would a Class 3 biologically persistent population have a functioning shortwave infrastructure? He picked up the mic. Lord Zex, he said. This is the Hardanger Ridge Station. We received your message. He released the mic. Static. Then the translated voice, and this time there was something different in the texture of it. A slight elevation of register, a change in rhythm. The translation architecture was struggling with something that might have been surprise. Human representative. Identify designation, and population authority. My name is Bastian. I don't have a title. I'm speaking for the people on this radio net, which is most of the people you haven't been able to process. I'd say it's good to talk, but I'm reserving judgment. A pause. Longer than the previous ones. You are the coordinator of the non-compliant elements. I'm one of several. We're not very hierarchical. That's one of the things that might be causing you problems. Another pause. Eric was next to him now, listening, not saying anything, his expression the one he wore when he was calculating something he didn't want to interrupt by speaking. Human Bastion. The penis hegemony has processed 47,000 populations across 12 stellar systems. Non-compliant elements in all previous operations were resolved within acceptable parameters. You should understand the historical context. 47 populations, Bastion said. That's a lot. Were any of them Norwegian? Static. The translation architecture did not have a response to this, apparently. Here's the thing, Bastion continued. We've been doing some math. Your compliance operation expected a population that would consolidate at the road-accessible locations, towns, major infrastructure, the places that show up on standard mapping systems. We didn't do that. You've processed maybe 60% of the valley population. The other 40% is spread across terrain that your drop pods aren't well suited for, coordinating on frequencies you hadn't prioritized, and learning very fast. And I want to be clear about this, we're not going anywhere. This is where we live. You came to us. We are very used to the conditions here. Your soldiers are compensating for the gravity differential, we've noticed. Urban, beside him, said nothing, but he nodded once, slowly. The longer this takes, Bastion said, the less your yield projections work. We've talked to people from Kristiansand to Tromsø. I don't know what Class 3 biologically persistent means in your system, but I'm guessing it means we're stubborn. So, what does this actually cost you, compared to whatever you get out of it? Because I think you're running the numbers right now, and I think the numbers are not going in the direction you expected. Long silence. The ship's red light pulsed outside the station windows. Then, Lord Zex will consider. The mic went quiet. Eric exhaled. Urban started laughing, very quietly, in the way he did when something was both very funny and very frightening, which was a specific laugh, and Bastion had always been fond of it. Lord Zex will consider, Urban repeated. He's checking his spreadsheets, Eric said. Leave him to it, Bastion said. In the meantime, we need to figure out what we're actually offering, because I suspect he's going to call back. He did. 4 hours later. The negotiation took 3 days. Bastion conducted it from the relay station, Urban beside him for the conversations that required a technical mind, Eric beside him for the conversations that required someone to identify when the translation architecture was doing something interesting. The penis sent a physical representative on the second day, a soldier who arrived at the ridge alone, unarmed in the human sense, carrying one of the blue light panels, and stood outside the station door in the wind with a patience that was either stoic or simply the absence of discomfort. Hard to tell. Bastion went out to meet it. They stood in the open air on the ridge, looking at each other. Up close, the soldier was taller than he'd realized. 2 meters at least, the pewter gray skin moving in that slow iridescent way, the pale eyes tracking him with an intelligence that was clearly present and clearly not human. The wind pulled at Bastion's jacket. The ships hung in the sky. The soldier's translation unit said, after a moment, "You are smaller than the projected resistance type." "There's not really a projected resistance type," Bastion said. "That's sort of the point. Your species does not have a designated resistance infrastructure. We have a lot of other infrastructure. That turns out to matter more." The soldier was quiet for a moment. Then, Lord Zex has determined that the operational cost-to-yield ratio for this sector has exceeded standard acceptable parameters. Meaning we're not worth the hassle. Meaning a revised administrative framework is indicated. What does that mean practically? Population elements will be returned to standard residential locations. A modified extraction quota will be established, with voluntary compliance mechanisms subject to negotiated terms. A pause. Lord Zex wishes it communicated that this is an administrative revision, not a retreat. Of course, Bastion said. How's Lord Zex doing? The translation unit hesitated. That is not a standard negotiation query. I know. I'm asking anyway. Another pause longer. Then Lord Zex is experiencing a data revision period. Bastion nodded. That sounds hard. Tell him we appreciate the conversation. The soldier looked at him for a moment with those wide, pale eyes. Then it said, quite precisely, "Your communication patterns are not consistent with any previously processed population type." "No," Bastion agreed. "Probably not." The soldier went back down the ridge. Bastion watched it go. He stood in the wind for a while, feeling the cold of it, looking at the ships. Very slowly, the red light was changing. Less like a pulse now, more like something powering down. Not all of it, he wanted some insight. Urban handed him a coffee. Eric was on the radio, updating the network. "Well," Urban said, "revised administrative framework. Modified extraction quota, voluntary compliance mechanisms. Which means, they're not leaving, but they're backing up. Urban thought about this. Is that enough? It was a genuine question, and Bastian sat with it honestly. The ships were still there. The hegemony was still there. The modified extraction quota and the voluntary compliance mechanisms were the beginning of a very long and complicated arrangement, not the end of anything. There would be more conversations. There would be moments that were harder than this one. There would be days when the ship's red light felt less like something powering down and more like something watching, waiting for the statistical anomaly to exhaust itself. But the people were off the processing lists. They were going home. That was real. For now, Bastian said. Yeah, for now it's enough. He sat down at the table. He picked up his coffee. Outside, the ship's lights shifted again, imperceptibly, towards something that looked from a certain angle like a decision being revised. Eric looked up from the radio. You know they're going to be back, right? Different terms, different moment, but back, probably. We should think about that. We will. I have ideas. I know you do. Some of them are actually good. I know that too. Urban was at the window, watching the valley. Somewhere down there, in the towns they'd been swept from, and the homes they'd been kept from for 4 days, people were beginning to move again. The lights of it were visible even from up here, small and ordinary and stubbornly present. I want to go home, Urban said. I want to fix the kitchen faucet. It's been dripping for 6 months. Yeah, Bastian said. The socket wrench is still on the table. We'll get it. I left my magazine, Bastian said, and both his brother and Eric looked at him, and he almost smiled. It had good injury statistics, the radio crackled. A voice from Voss. Ridge Station, are you still there? Bastian picked up the mic. Still here, he said. All right, let's talk about what comes next. The ships held their position above the valley, enormous and patient, carrying within them the administrative apparatus of an interstellar hegemony that had processed 47 populations across 12 stellar systems without encountering meaningful friction. Lord Zex, in his command space somewhere in the largest ship, was reviewing data that did not fit his models. His analysts were running scenarios. His operational timeline was being revised for the 3rd time in 4 days, which was unprecedented. Below, in a concrete relay station on a Norwegian ridgeline, 3 people with cold coffee and a shortwave radio were doing the same thing. The thing about a statistical anomaly is that it starts as an anomaly. Given enough time, given enough data points, it starts to look like a pattern. And given enough of a pattern, the models have to change. The penis hegemony was very good at models. They had excellent models. They had been refining their models for longer than humanity had written language. But the models had never included Hardanger. They had never included the old paths, and the storm drains, and the NATO relay stations, and the shortwave frequencies, and the cold lefts, and the socket wrenches, and the headlamps, and the thermoses of still somehow warm coffee, and the 3 people who were, right now, talking to 53 other groups across the country about what had worked and what hadn't, and what they should do differently next time. The models had never included the knowledge that there would be a next time, and that was all right because they were already planning for it. Outside, the red light pulsed. Inside, the radio talked. The wind came back up, worrying the spruce trees on the ridge in that familiar way, that old Norwegian evening way, full of crow and cold and the promise of morning. Bastian listened to it. He thought, we are very stubborn, he thought. That is going to be a problem for a lot of people before this is over. He thought it like a promise.